Today we are going to be talking about JavaScript objects. Last week we talked about JavaScript arrays, which allow us to hold a collection of things in JavaScript, which can be really handy. And objects do a similar thing where they also allow us to contain a collection of things in JavaScript, but they differ in quite a few ways, particularly that it's a little bit more flexible and extensive in what you can do with them. So let's take a look at what we can do with objects. So in JavaScript, sometimes we need to store a more complex set of information than an array will allow for. Whenever this need arises, it's time to reach for an object. Objects organize collections in a way that allows for easy retrieval and grouping. That's important, the grouping part. Objects are created by using curly braces, and usually you do a function, or sorry, not a function, you do a variable declaration, an assignment when you're working with objects. Otherwise, you can't really go back to retrieve them, and they don't really do a whole lot. So you'll see this really commonly as the basic syntax, the most simple syntax to create an object. Let Benny, and we're going with a Lego theme here today. So this little guy's name is Benny. So let Benny equal an empty object. So here we defined a variable Benny and assigned it to an empty object. Go ahead and create a new JavaScript file, Chrome snippet, or CodePen if you'd like to follow along. So as we go along here, let's just go ahead and do this directly in the Chrome DevTools. I'm gonna clear this out, make sure you have the console open. And we're gonna copy and paste and write out some of the examples here from this lesson directly into the console. So let's start with that. Let's say let Benny equal empty object. Oop, that's not right. And make sure you do the curly braces. Cool, and we'll add a semicolon there at the end, hit enter, cool. So we have now created an empty object with the name of Benny. Okay, and just as an aside here, so we're going to be using the let keyword within the DevTools here today, because if we were using const, we're going to want to change this Benny variable as we go through the lesson. And if we were using const, it's not going to let us do that because a constant cannot be redefined. So in the real world, when you're writing code in VS Code in your applications, use const as much as possible. But today we're using let for that purpose, just so you know. Okay. Sweet. So like we said before, objects will come in handy if you're trying to group and relate multiple pieces of information together. And you'll kind of know when you run across a situation where an object is preferable to an array. But for this example, let's say that you're building an online Lego minifigure builder, and you want to use, you want the user to be able to choose different colors and pieces for their little minifigure and give it a name or something. So let's start out with this object as an example that has three properties. It has head, body, and helmet. So we're going to go ahead and start from fresh here. So we're going to say let Benny equal, and we're going to do an object. Oh, sorry, object here. And a nice thing about this is you can actually hit enter and it's not going to execute this because it doesn't have a closing bracket yet. So you can go ahead and do this on a new line. So we're going to start with helmet, and we're going to make this true. I don't know if you remember, but the true and false values, those are Booleans. So this helmet here is going to take a Boolean. And then we're going to do another one, torso, and then that's a colon. And then we'll do a string. We're going to call it red. And then we are going to do a last one of legs, colon. We're going to do string blue. Okay. And we're going to close it off and hit enter. So we're going to go through the syntax, don't worry, but make sure you have colons between the two words on each line. So we have helmet here and then colon, and then the value, and then a comma. So don't forget the comma. So when you have multiple lines here, you're going to need to put commas between them and then close that up. But for now, just go ahead and copy this syntax. We'll talk about it in just a second. So we've now created an object that has three properties, and it's called Benny. So the properties of an object always have a name, a colon, and then a value. So name, colon, value. And if your object has more than one property, you must separate them with a comma, otherwise your code will break. So go ahead and console.log this object so we can take a look at it in here. So we're going to do console.log Benny. Okay, and we actually see that we get this object printed back out here. And moving forward, instead of actually typing out console.log, I'm just going to type it here, type the variable. And the reason this works the exact same way is because we are already in the console, basically. So console.log is useful if this is written from your script, from your code, because then that will actually write it out to the console. But since we're literally writing this JavaScript in the console, saying console.log is kind of redundant. So we're just going to go ahead and use the variable names from here on out. But if you were doing this in CodePen or in a snippet or something like that, you'll need to use the console.log statement to get some kind of output. Okay. Great. So we console log this out and we see this spit out. One of the cool things here is that we see a little gray triangle on the left-hand side. Now, if we click on this, it actually kind of expands our object so that we can see more details about these properties. Well, in this case, not more details, but we see them laid out in a different way. A lot of times objects will have hundreds and hundreds of properties in it. So you don't always want it to automatically expand out and spit all of this stuff out and just take up your whole console here. So Chrome is kind of helping us out by just showing us kind of a little preview of it. And as soon as there's too many here, it'll do a ... And then if we want to look into it more, we can open it with this little arrow and dig in. You're going to see some other things, this proto object or this proto property here. Don't worry about that. Every object has this proto property, and we'll talk about that more in the future. But for now, you can go ahead and ignore that and just focus on the ones that we've created. Cool. Alrighty, object properties. Objects are made up of a collection of properties. You could have hundreds of properties, or you could just have one. Properties contain information or functionality that is labeled by its name, or sometimes called a key. And this here on the left-hand side, so for example, let's look at helmet. So helmet here is a key, and then we have the colon, and then this is the value. So we have keys and values, and you'll often hear these referred to as key value pairs. And those are key value pairs always live inside of an object, and it's basically just this combination of what it's called and what its value is. Called a key value pair. So this one is a helmet, and then that value is true. This one's a string. This one's a string. Cool. So we've looked at how to create objects and how we can give objects properties, but let's now look at how we can actually retrieve values and get stuff out of our objects properties to console log them or to see them. So let's start out with his torso. So if we do Benny and we do dot torso, that's actually going to give us back just this little piece of this object. So that didn't give us the whole object back. It just gave us back the value of the torso property. So Benny.torso gave us back red, which is awesome. So what we used here, what's happening is something called dot notation. So dot notation is the way that we access information, specific pieces of information inside of an object. You can think of dot notation kind of as a treasure map or instructions or directions for our program to look for things. So when we said Benny.torso, we are first up telling the browser to go find Benny, go find the variable Benny. And it finds Benny, it realizes Benny is an object. And it says, okay, cool, I got Benny, I know where it is. It saw that in memory after we hit to find it. Then it sees the dot. As soon as it sees that period after a variable name, it is assuming that the variable you're calling this on is an object. That's how you have to have an object if you're going to use dot notation. So it says, okay, cool, this is an object, which is true, and it knows that. Otherwise, this throw an error that says, all right, great. So we want to go into the object. As soon as it sees that dot, it basically means enter into the object. So we say, Benny, go inside of Benny, and then look for torso. So then now at this point, the code is now inside of Benny, and it's looking through all these properties, and it says helmet, legs, torso. Okay, sweet. So it found it. It found torso, and it's then going to return us just the value of that property. So dot notation is kind of like instructions, saying first go into Benny, then look for torso. Okay. So let's look at helmet, for example. So we do Benny.helmet. We see that we get back its value, which is a Boolean true. So we got Benny.helmet gave us back true. Cool. Okay, so we have retrieved a couple of these properties from our Benny object. But let's say we wanted to change it after we've created it. If we wanted to add some more properties into the Benny object, We could do that after the fact, even after it has been defined. So let's see what happens if we try to add a name property to Benny. So let's do Benny.name. So this is also dot notation, very similar to how we access properties, and it knows what I'm going to do here because I did this before, but we're going to write it out together. So I'm actually going to assign this name property to an array, and objects can contain any type of anything you want to add in there, much like how arrays are, where they can contain other objects, they can contain other arrays, anything you want, strings, numbers. So inside of here, we want to do an array that has his first name. So we're going to do Benny and his last name. We're going to call him Spaceman. Cool. We're going to hit enter, and it just tells us what we added. Now let's take a look at Benny again. So let's just console log Benny. Let's use my cat. Okay, so when we console log Benny now, we see that something has changed. So previously we had helmet, legs, and torso, and that's it. Now we have helmet, legs, name, and torso. And name actually also has a little gray triangle next to it. So we can open that up and look inside of our array. So by default, Chrome collapses arrays and objects just to make sure that things look concise and clean. So when we open up our array, we have Benny at index of 0, and we have Spaceman at index of 1. Cool. So we were able to change the object after the fact by using dot notation to assign new properties. And this should hopefully look a little familiar as well. So we see, everything after the period here just looks like a variable reassignment. And that's kind of what's happening. This is just how we add properties. We are assigning the value of an array to Benny.name. And this does, some of that work for us and kind of creates that property. As soon as it realizes that we're assigning something, it says, oh, that doesn't exist. I'm going to go ahead and add it into that object. So this is a nice quick way to add new things into an object. And like we said before, they can contain anything, arrays, Booleans, other objects. Those objects could have objects. You can do anything you want. Functions, strings, numbers. Okay, so yeah, now try to add another property called age that has a number value. And then we'll console log out our object to see if that worked. So if we wanted to add the property age to Benny, what are we going to do? We're going to do Benny dot. We're going to use dot notation. We're going to do age, and we are going to assign it to something rather than retrieving it. And we're going to say his age is, I don't know, 75. He's probably not that old. Let's say 55. Okay, semicolon. So Benny.age equals 55. And this is just a number. So we didn't actually make that a string or anything. We made that a straight up number. So if we go ahead and console log Benny now, let's see what he looks like. Did he change? And it looks like he did. So we open him up and we see age 55. Cool. That's what we just added. Helmet, true. Legs blue, name. And we see that other one we added is still in there as well. So we're just continually adding into this object now. Great. Okay. So we've retrieved some values, we've added some values, we're manipulating data within our object here, within our Benny object. But now let's talk about if we wanted to add some functionality to this object. I'm going to clear my console here, so bear with me one sec. Let's take a look at Benny again, make sure we have that open. Okay, so if we wanted to add a function into this object, which, as we said, an object can really contain anything, so it can totally have a function inside of it. But if we do add a function in here, it does some special things, and it's actually called a method. You don't normally just call them functions when it's a function inside of an object. You call those a method, just to differentiate between properties and methods. So properties just contain values, and methods contain functionality. They do things. So when we add a function to an object, we're creating a method. So let's go ahead and add one to Benny. So if we do Benny dot, we're gonna use dot notation again, anytime we're adding in here. Let's call this catchphrase. So Benny dot catchphrase equals, because we're assigning here. Now we're gonna do this function a little bit differently. Previously, we have created functions like this. So we've created our functions as arrow functions, which is the, the new ES6 syntax for functions. And most of the time when you're writing a function, you want to use this syntax. But we're actually going to change this a little bit, the syntax here. So instead of the arrow, we're going to delete that arrow. And then to the left of the parentheses, we're actually going to use the function keyword. And the reason we're doing this is because there's some special functionality within methods that we're going to look at in just a second here. Well, let's define our function like this, and it's very similar to the way that arrow function syntax works, with some small differences that we'll see in a bit here. Okay, shoot. So I just defined that, but it didn't actually do anything. So I'm going to drop that bracket down. And remember, if you wanted to do a new line without executing the code, you can hold Shift. So if you hold Shift, you can add new lines in here without actually executing, which can be really handy if you're trying to format it for just make it easier to read. Okay, so we're going to reassign Benny to a catchphrase here and actually add something in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an alert inside of this function. So we're going to do alert, and we're going to say, hi, I love space. And we need to close those quotes. Okay, so that string is closed. Oh my gosh. Sorry guys, I just messed that up. Okay. So now we've added a method to the Benny object. Let's take a look at him, see how he's changed. So we crack open Benny with age, and then now we have this catchphrase here, and we see that there's actually a little F with the parentheses here. So this is Chrome's way of just quickly telling us what these are. So we can see really, really fast that, catchphrase is actually a function, which is a method, and it gives us a preview of what it is even. So we open this up, it tells us some details about the function. Don't need to worry about that. If you hover over it though, it actually gives you the whole function definition there. So let's use it. Let's use our method. So if we wanted to use the catchphrase, we're going to do that similarly to how we access other properties. We're going to say Benny.catchphrase, and that should give you a little preview there. And if we do this without invoking the function or invoking this method, it's actually just going to return us the function itself. Because this method works like all other functions, where whenever we want to use them, we have to trigger them or invoke them or call them. So remember that we do that with the parentheses. So now if we run this, this is saying, hey, go into Benny, look for catchphrase and execute it, and actually run the catchphrase function. So when we do that, we actually see an alert pop up that says what we passed in there. So we say, hi, I love space. Cool. So we've now been able to actually use a function, a method that we have added into our object. So this shows us how an object can really contain anything, and how we can access all of the different things that we add to an object. Okay, so we already went over this stuff. Okie doke. Now we're going to talk about the reason that we did this function with this different syntax than the arrow function. And what this revolves around is the idea of this. And you'll hear the term this used in the context of objects a lot when you're reading articles online or you're looking things up, and you'll also see it in a lot of examples. It's kind of difficult to explain without just looking at it. So let's go ahead and take a look at our function here, or sorry, at our object. And we are going to add a new method to understand this concept of this, quote unquote. So what we're going to add in is a greeting function. Sorry, and I'll just start this from scratch. Okay, so Benny.greet. So this is going to be a function. So we're going to assign it to that function keyword. I'm going to go ahead and close it off. Put a tab in here. Okay, now inside of our greeting function, we're also going to do an alert. So this is going to be very, very similar to our other one. But instead of just having a plain string in here, we're going to use another property on the object itself. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and do a template literal, which is backtick. Backtick is the key right above tab on the left-hand side. and we're going to say, my name is, and then to use a variable in here, we're going to do the $, curly brace syntax to actually, it's called interpolation inside of a template literal. And we're going to say this dot name, and go ahead, do bracket 0 bracket. Let's see if this works. The syntax highlighting isn't working perfectly, but let's test it now. Okay, so do Benny.greet. And remember, because this is a method, it's a function, which means we need to invoke it. Benny.greet. Okay, so we see my name is Benny. Cool. So that is interesting because this function, we didn't actually pass the word Benny or that specific string into this function at all. What we did was we said this dot name and then index of 0. So when we say this inside of the Benny object, let's take a look at Benny again to see what this looks like, just so we have a little context. Oh, whoops, sorry, I need to close this. Okay, printed that out twice, that's okay. So inside of Benny, we have catchphrase and greet, which are both methods now. So if we look at greet, or sorry, if we can hover over it there. So we see this dot name. So what this is looking at is basically the object itself. It's saying this is the object that the method is a part of. And dot is normal dot notation. So it's kind of like going backwards. It's saying like this, okay, let's go back and look at the object that I am a part of, and then dot name. And then it sees, okay, cool. It's right here. Here is dot name. And then index of 0 is Benny. So that's why running Benny.greet with this function definition is going to give us back his actual name. So Benny.greet gives us his name because it's looking at this, and this is basically what the object itself is. It's kind of like how if in the terminal, if you wanted to go back a directory, you would do .. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like this is saying go back .. and then wherever that is, the directions now are to say, you know, .greet, look for the method greet, and it found it, and it gave us that from that function. So this concept is can be a little confusing, and I may be explaining it in a confusing way as well, but we're going to look at a lot more examples in the future that will help to clarify this. No pun intended. But just for now, it's a good thing to know about, and to know that it can be really useful. You might not be reaching for this tool a lot, but if you can, I encourage you to experiment with it and try to use this as often as you can, just to kind of grasp the concept. And looking at examples is really helpful. Maybe this isn't the best one, but yeah, this right here. So, you know, this dot name, and also just to be extra clear, in case that template literal was a little confusing, let's go ahead and do a new greeting function. I'm going to call this old greet, and we're going to use a different kind of string concatenation, just in case that's a little bit more obvious. So instead of this, we're going to say my name is, and we're going to do that + concatenation. So this is the ES5, the older version of string concatenation, and then this would be this dot name index of 0. And let's add an exclamation mark at the end for fun. Okay, so now if we do Benny.oldGreet and invoke it, my name is Benny. So we get the same output. I just wanted, in case that template literal was confusing, the template literal wasn't the important part. The important part here is the this dot name. Okie doke. Now, speaking of dot notation, and as we're looking at how we access properties, we're going to take a look at nested objects. And you might be able to guess what a nested object is. And that's basically just an object inside of another object, like a Russian nesting doll. So let's add another object into Benny. So let's see, what should we call it? Benny dot call it his closet, like he has a closet. And we're just going to make this an empty object for now. So Benny.closet. So now if we look at Benny, we should see that property added. Benny.closet is an empty object. We can actually open that up. By default, it has this proto that we can ignore for now. So we've added an empty object into Benny. Now, if we wanted to add something, add a property to the empty closet object, we can do that with dot notation. And remember that dot notation works like directions and instructions to tell the code where to go. So let's say we wanted to add a t-shirt to his closet. So let's go ahead and start that process. So we're going to say, oh, sorry, not let. We're going to say Benny dot closet, and we're going to do another dot notation here. Dot t-shirt, and I'm not going to do a dash there, equals yellow. Okay, so what's going to happen here is if we think about how we're giving directions to the computer, we're looking for Benny. It's going to find the Benny object. And then we're saying, okay, dot closet, cool. It's going in and it finds the closet property. Then it sees that second dot and it says, ooh, okay, closet must be an object. So then it tries to go inside of this closet property and it succeeds because closet is an object. So then we go inside of here and then dot t-shirt. And then the next thing is an assignment. We say, oh, okay, I'm assigning the property t-shirt to the string value of yellow. So what's going to happen is we're going to see that closet object now populate with a string of yellow, or well, sorry, with the key of t-shirt and the value of yellow. So let's see this happen. Now let's look at Benny again. Closet, t-shirt, yellow. Awesome. So we were actually able to add another property to a nested object inside of Benny here by using dot notation to access it. Which is really powerful. And it's also how we retrieve things, not just set things. So the getting and setting is similar syntax with that dot notation. So if we wanted to just look at it, sorry, let me clear my console here. Let's do Benny.closet.t-shirt. This is going to give us yellow. So it prints out what color his t-shirt is, that property that we added in by using the same style of dot notation to get in there. All right. And this is sometimes, so when you nest an object like this, if we open this guy up here and we see closet here, so this is sometimes called sub-namespacing or sub-namespaces. Honestly, I don't really run across that term very often in my work in the career field. Maybe other teams use it more often, but I actually hadn't heard that before. So sub-namespaces is another term for nested objects. And then something you will hear pretty often is that whole idea of doing multiple dots. This is sometimes called drilling down. I don't know exactly why, but basically the idea is you're starting on the outside of the object and you're going in deeper into the middle. So you're drilling down into the object. So when people say drill down, often they're talking about using dot notation to access nested objects, which is a faster way to say that. Okay. So that's an introduction, a primer to objects. There's a lot more that we could go over, but I think that it's good to let some of these initial concepts sink in before we go too deep. But really, the purpose of them is to, like we said at the beginning, is to collect and group and organize pieces of data and functionality and information about one thing that needs to be grouped together. So that's why the homework for today is actually going to be a Lego minifigure builder, like our little example had here. And the way that it's going to be helpful is that we're going to create minifigures and give them a name. So if you say, John has a yellow head, a blue shirt, and red pants, then you're going to make that John object and you're going to save that, set that aside and say, okay, that's how John is set up. And then you're going to be able to create a new one and say, okay, let's make a new Lego minifigure. And this is Sarah, and Sarah has a red head and blue shirt and orange pants. And you have that Sarah object that's going to be set aside separately. And that's going to have its own pieces of information inside of it. And then those will point to some images and we'll be able to visualize these changes here. But hopefully the homework will help you to understand how objects are helpful, because this would be nearly impossible to do with just arrays. It would be hard to group this data together in a logical way that's easy to access and display on the page without an object. So try to think about it that way. Think about, oh, like, how could I do this differently? You know, and hopefully you'll appreciate the necessity of objects. And the more code that you write, the more you'll understand how great they are. So that is the introduction to JavaScript objects.